I said step away from him. That's a lawful order, paramedic.
And I am following my lawful duty to save this man's life. His heart is unstable. I cannot step away.
You are obstructing. You are under arrest.
The alert blared through the cabin of Pinellas County Ambulance 7, a jarring three-tone chime that sliced through the mundane midday quiet. Alex Reyes, 30 years old and with a calmness forged in the crucible of 1,000 emergencies, was already reaching for the tablet mounted on the dash before the dispatcher's voice crackled to life. His movements were economical, precise, a study in practiced efficiency. Medic 7, respond code 3 to the Clearwater Marina, Dock C. Reports of an adult male, difficulty breathing, possible allergic reaction. Law enforcement is en route. Medic 7 responding, Alex said into the radio, his voice a steady baritone that betrayed none of the sudden surge of adrenaline coursing through him. Beside him, his partner Sarah Jenkins, a 10-year veteran with a wry smile and the steady hands of a surgeon, already had the heavy vehicle roaring to life. The siren's first yelp cut through the humid Florida air as she expertly pulled the ambulance out into traffic, the force of the acceleration pressing Alex back into his seat. The world outside became a blur of palm trees and sun-bleached storefronts. This was the transition, from the quiet lulls of station life to the compressed, high-stakes reality of a life on the line. Alex's mind was already a flurry of calculations, a cascade of differential diagnoses. Difficulty breathing at a marina. Anaphylaxis from a bee or wasp sting was high on the list. Could be a marine animal sting, though less common. Or it could be a cardiac event masquerading as something else. The location was the first problem. Marinas were a logistical nightmare. Narrow docks, crowds of onlookers, and difficult access for a stretcher. Dock C, Sarah confirmed, her knuckles white on the steering wheel as she navigated a turn with practiced ease. That's way out at the end by the charter boats. It's going to be a sea of tourists. Just get us as close as you can, Alex said, his eyes already scanning the medical bag between the seats. He mentally inventoried its contents. EpiPens, Solumedrol, Benadryl, intubation kit, IV supplies. He was a library of protocols, each one a well-worn path in his mind, ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. He had learned this trade not just in the classroom, but in the chaotic aftermath of highway pileups and in the cramped, desperate confines of third-floor walk-ups. He had brought people back from the brink with nothing but his hands and his training. At 30, he had the experience of a man twice his age, etched not in wrinkles, but in the focused intensity of his gaze. He pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves, the familiar snap against his wrists a small, grounding ritual that signaled the beginning of the battle. He was born and raised in St. Petersburg, a product of the sun and the salt air, and he was exceptionally good at his job. It wasn't arrogance, it was a prerequisite. In this line of work, the space between good and the best you can be was measured in millimeters of an endotracheal tube, in seconds of oxygen deprivation to the brain. It was a space where second best was a synonym for failure. They screamed past the entrance to the marina, the siren parting the sea of cars and pedestrians. Sarah didn't slow, expertly maneuvering the ambulance down a service lane that ran parallel to the waterfront, getting them precious yards closer than the main parking lot would allow. They could see the commotion before they came to a full stop. A dense knot of people on the longest pier, a human beacon of distress. Sarah brought the rig to a halt, the tires crunching on the crushed shell path. Their response time was just under 7 minutes. Excellent, but an eternity for someone who couldn't breathe. Alex was out the door before Sarah had thrown the vehicle in park. He grabbed the jump bag, a 40-pound pack containing the essential tools for advanced life support, and the cardiac monitor. Sarah, you're with me. We'll need the stretcher, but let's assess first. Might be a walkout, might be a carry-out. On your 6, she called back, grabbing her own smaller Airway bag. They moved toward the crowd at a fast, ground-eating jog. The onlookers parted for them, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine alarm. In the center of the circle, a man was on his knees, slumped against a large piling. He was in his 50s, wearing a brightly colored tourist shirt, and his skin was a terrifying patchwork of red, blotchy hives. He was gasping, his breaths coming in ragged, high-pitched wheezes that were audible from 10 feet away. Strider. The sound of a closing airway. The sound of impending death. Alex dropped to his knees beside him, his world instantly narrowing to the man on the dock. The noise of the crowd, the squawking of the gulls, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. "Sir, my name is Alex. I'm a paramedic. We're here to help you." A woman, presumably his wife, knelt beside him, her face pale with terror. "He was stung by a wasp! On his neck! He said he was allergic, but his EpiPen, it was in the car!" Alex's fingers were already on the man's neck, not just feeling for a pulse, but assessing the tissue itself. It was swollen, edematous, the skin tight and hot to the touch. The man's eyes were wide with panic, his lips and tongue visibly swelling, tinged with a dusky blue. Cyanosis. He was losing the fight for oxygen. "He's in severe anaphylactic shock," Alex announced, his voice projecting a calm authority that cut through the panic. "Sarah, I need 0.5 milligrams of epinephrine intramuscular now, and an 18-gauge IV wide-open saline." Sarah was already working, her movements a blur of efficiency. She drew up the epinephrine, swabbed the man's thigh, and administered the life-saving injection. But Alex knew it might not be enough, and it might not work fast enough. The man's wheezing was getting worse, the pitch getting higher. His airway was closing with terrifying speed. Alex attached a pulse oximeter to the man's finger. The display read 84% and was dropping fast. "Epi is in," Sarah confirmed, already prepping the IV line. "It's not working fast enough," Alex stated, his mind racing ahead. "His airway is almost completely obstructed. We need to intubate." He opened the airway bag, his hands moving with practiced speed, selecting a laryngoscope and an endotracheal tube. He positioned the man's head, tilting it back, but he could already see the problem. The swelling was so profound, so distorting, that there would be no way to visualize the vocal cords. It would be a blind, impossible intubation. The man let out a final, gurgling gasp, and his eyes rolled back. His chest stopped moving. "He stopped breathing!" the wife screamed, her voice cracking with despair. "His pulse is thready, but we're losing it," Sarah confirmed, her fingers pressed against the man's carotid artery. The pulse oximeter alarm began to shriek, a frantic, high-pitched beep that signaled critical hypoxia. The number on the screen plummeted. 75%, 70%, 65%. They had seconds. Alex's mind discarded the intubation plan. It was no longer a viable option. There was only one path left, the most invasive, high-risk, and rarely performed procedure in a paramedic's arsenal: a surgical airway. "I can't intubate him. The airway is completely swollen shut. I have to open his throat," Alex announced, his voice rock-steady, a stark contrast to the chaos erupting around them. He looked directly at Sarah. "Get the Crite kit, now!" It was a command that carried the weight of a life. A cricothyrotomy was a last resort, a procedure of controlled violence designed to bypass a completely obstructed upper airway. It involved making an incision in the patient's neck and inserting a breathing tube directly into the trachea. It was a procedure most paramedics went their entire careers without ever performing outside of a training mannequin. It was messy, dangerous, and the only thing that could save this man's life. Sarah didn't hesitate. Her training took over, her hands finding the small, pre-packaged surgical kit in the airway bag. She ripped it open, laying out its sterile contents on the wooden planks of the dock. A scalpel, a tracheal hook, a small breathing tube, antiseptic swabs. "Police are here," she said, her voice tight, glancing over her shoulder at a uniformed officer jogging down the pier. Alex didn't look. He couldn't. His entire universe was the patch of skin on the dying man's neck. He tilted the man's head back, extending the neck to make the anatomy more prominent. With his gloved fingers, he palpated the throat, searching for the critical landmarks: the prominent thyroid cartilage, or Adam's apple, and the small, soft depression just below it. The cricothyroid membrane. That was his target. A space no bigger than a dime. "I've got the landmark," Alex said, as much to himself as to Sarah. He took the antiseptic swab she handed him and quickly cleaned the area. He then took the scalpel. The polished steel gleamed in the bright afternoon sun. For a fraction of a second, the world seemed to hold its breath. The shouts of the crowd, the distant sirens, the lapping of the water against the pilings, it all fell away. There was only the scalpel, his hand, and the decision he was about to make. He made a 1-centimeter vertical incision, cutting firmly through the skin. Then, he turned the scalpel and made a second horizontal incision through the membrane itself. There was a slight pop and a rush of air. Blood welled up, but it was minimal. He had done it. "I'm in," he said, his voice a low, focused hum. "Hook!" Sarah slapped the small, curved tracheal hook into his palm. He inserted it into the incision, pulling the cartilage upward to open the airway further. The man's body gave a slight, reflexive cough. "Give me the tube." Sarah handed him the small-caliber breathing tube. With a final, precise movement, Alex guided the tube into the opening, past the hook, and down into the man's trachea. It was a perfect insertion. "I need the BVM," Alex ordered. Sarah was already there, disconnecting the oxygen mask from the bag valve mask and connecting the device directly to the new, surgically created airway in the man's neck. She handed the bag to Alex. He placed the mask over the tube opening to form a seal and squeezed the bag, forcing pure oxygen directly into the man's lungs. The man's chest rose. It was a beautiful, miraculous sight. He squeezed the bag again. The chest rose again. He looked up at the pulse oximeter. The number had stopped its terrifying descent. It was holding at 68%. Now it began to climb. 72%, 78%, 85%. The shrill alarm silenced itself. The dusky blue color began to recede from the man's lips, replaced by a healthier pink. A weak but steady pulse returned under Sarah's fingers. They had pulled him back from the precipice. The entire procedure had taken less than 30 seconds. It was in this moment, in the immediate adrenaline-fueled afterglow of a life saved, that a new sound broke through Alex's intense focus. The sharp, authoritative click of boots on the dock behind him. "What the hell is going on here?" The voice was young, sharp, and laced with an aggressive impatience that felt jarringly out of place. "I said, what are you doing to him?" Alex didn't look up. He couldn't. He was manually breathing for his patient, each squeeze of the bag a conscious, life-sustaining act. "I'm a paramedic," Alex said, his voice firm, his eyes still locked on his patient's rising chest. "This man had a complete airway obstruction. I've just established a surgical airway. We need to transport immediately." "Surgical airway? You cut his throat?" the voice said, now closer, laced with disbelief and accusation. "Drop what you're doing right now. This is a crime scene." The words hung in the hot, salty air, so utterly nonsensical that for a moment Alex thought he had misheard. Crime scene? He risked a quick glance up from his patient. A police officer was standing over him, his shadow falling across the desperate medical tableau. He was young, no older than Alex himself, with a tightly squared jaw and mirrored sunglasses that hid his eyes, creating an impassive, intimidating mask. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid. The nameplate read, K. Novak. His hand was not resting on his hip, but was hooked by the thumb onto his duty belt, inches from his holstered sidearm. It was a posture of casual dominance, a silent declaration of control. "Officer, this is a medical emergency," Alex said, his tone deliberately even and professional. He had to de-escalate this. His patient's life still hung by a thread. The man was breathing only because Alex was breathing for him. He had an anaphylactic reaction to a wasp sting. His airway swelled shut. "I performed a cricothyrotomy to save his life. We need to get him to the hospital now." Officer Novak took another step closer, his polished black boots planting firmly on the dock planks, a territorial stance. "I don't know what you think you were doing, but you just stabbed a man in the neck in a public place. For all I know, you assaulted him. This is a potential crime scene until I say otherwise. That means you stop what you're doing and you step away from the individual." Alex's mind reeled. The absurdity of the accusation was staggering. He looked at the man on the ground, whose life was literally connected to the bag in his hands, then at the terrified wife, then at the crowd of onlookers who were now murmuring in confusion. He looked at Sarah, whose face was a mask of disbelief. "Officer, with all due respect," Alex said, his voice tight with a frustration he was struggling to contain, "I am a licensed paramedic with Pinellas County Fire Rescue. This procedure, a cricothyrotomy, is within my scope of practice for a patient with a completely obstructed airway. It's the only reason this man is still alive. You can see his wife right there. You can ask any of these witnesses. He collapsed. They called 911. "That's for me to determine, not you," Novak snapped, his voice sharp and dismissive. He was not listening. He was waiting for compliance. "I give an order, you follow it. It's that simple. Now, for the last time, back away from him." Something cold and hard settled in Alex's gut. This wasn't about procedure. This wasn't about securing a scene. This was about power. He had worked alongside hundreds of law enforcement officers over the years. He knew the dance, the professional respect, the coordination of duties. But this was different. He had never encountered such a blatant, dangerous disregard for a life hanging in the balance in favor of asserting authority. The man on the ground, though stabilized for the moment, was far from safe. He was on a knife's edge. Every second spent arguing, every delay, increased the risk of brain damage from the preceding hypoxia and the risk of cardiac arrest. Alex made a decision. He would not be intimidated. He would not let this officer's ego cost his patient his life. He turned his full attention back to the man on the ground, effectively dismissing the officer standing over him. "Sarah," Alex said, his voice now a low, urgent command. "Let's get the stretcher positioned. We need to package and go. His blood pressure is probably in the toilet. We need to get him on a dopamine drip as soon as we're rolling." Sarah, who had been watching the exchange with wide, anxious eyes, hesitated for a fraction of a second before her training and loyalty took over. She nodded curtly and turned to move toward the ambulance. But Officer Novak moved faster. He stepped directly into her path, physically blocking her. "Nobody is going anywhere," he said, his voice low and menacing. "And you," he said, turning his attention back to Alex, "did you not hear me? I gave you a lawful order, paramedic." "And I am following my lawful duty as a licensed medical professional to provide life-saving care," Alex retorted, his eyes still on his patient. He continued to squeeze the bag in a steady, rhythmic cadence. He didn't raise his voice. He kept it clinical, professional, a wall of calm against the officer's rising aggression. "Florida Statute 401.445 protects my right and responsibility to treat a critical patient. Interfering with that treatment is a felony. Now, you can either help us by clearing a path for the stretcher, or you can step back and let us do our jobs." The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. The tourists were watching, their phones now emerging from pockets, small red lights blinking as they recorded. Alex was vaguely aware of them, a periphery of witnesses to this insane standoff. The only sounds were the soft whoosh of the BVM, the lapping of the water, and the distant cry of a gull. Novak had been challenged. He had been quoted the law, and in front of an audience, he had been defied. The mirrored sunglasses gave nothing away, but Alex could feel the rage radiating from him, a palpable heat that was more intense than the afternoon sun. "I need to see your identification," Novak said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. He had shifted tactics. If he couldn't intimidate Alex with orders, he would bog him down in procedure, forcing a choice between the patient and compliance. "My identification is in my wallet in the ambulance," Alex replied without missing a beat in his rhythmic bagging. "My partner can retrieve it for you, or you can verify my credentials and my presence at this scene through your own dispatch. But I am not stopping life-sustaining treatment of a dying man to show you my driver's license." "So you're refusing to identify yourself?" Novak pressed, framing the situation in the language of a police report. "I'm refusing to abandon my patient," Alex corrected him firmly. "There's a difference. He looked over at Sarah, who was still blocked by the officer. "Sarah, call dispatch. Advise them we have police interference at the scene and request a fire rescue supervisor respond immediately." The request for a supervisor was a clear escalation, a formal challenge to Novak's authority. The officer's jaw tightened. "You think that's going to help you?" he sneered. "You're the one obstructing an investigation." "What investigation, officer?" Alex shot back, his own patience, a deep and usually unshakable well, finally beginning to run dry. "The investigation into a wasp sting? This man is my only priority. Now move out of my way." For a moment, they were locked in a stalemate. A paramedic on his knees, one hand holding a scalpel-borne airway open, the other pumping life into a man's lungs. A police officer on his feet, arms crossed, the symbol of the law becoming an obstacle to life itself. The air crackled with a tension that was thicker than the humid air. The crowd of onlookers was muttering now, their voices rising in a chorus of disbelief and outrage. "Hey, leave him alone!" a man in a fishing hat shouted. "He's trying to help him, for God's sake!" Novak's head snapped toward the man. "You stay out of this or you'll be the next one in cuffs," he yelled, pointing an accusatory finger. That was the opening Sarah needed. While Novak's attention was diverted, she sidestepped him and made a break for the ambulance to grab the stretcher and, more importantly, to make the call for a supervisor. The small victory was short-lived. Novak, realizing his mistake, turned his fury back to Alex. He moved with a sudden, shocking speed, closing the distance between them. He didn't grab Alex, not yet. He kicked the corner of the open airway kit, scattering sterile supplies across the weathered, dirty planks of the dock. Syringes, gauze pads, medication vials, the tools of Alex's trade, skittered and rolled, some falling between the cracks into the water below. It was a petty, aggressive act of dominance. "I gave you an order, paramedic," Novak growled, leaning down, his face inches from Alex's. The smell of cheap aftershave and fury filled Alex's senses. "You seem to think you're in charge here. Let me be very clear. You are not." The man on the ground let out a low moan, his body tensing. His pulse, which had been strengthening, began to feel weak and thready again under Alex's free hand. The patient was crashing. The stress, the delay, it was all taking its toll. "He's becoming hypotensive," Alex said, his voice a strained plea, trying one last time to appeal to reason, to the shared duty of public service he thought they both held. "Officer, please, we have to go. You are actively harming my patient." Novak seemed to see the plea not as a request for help, but as a confirmation of his own power. He had Alex right where he wanted him, on his knees, desperate. He straightened up, a cruel, self-satisfied smile touching the corner of his lips. "You're right," Novak said. "We are done here." Then before Alex could react, Novak's hand clamped down on his upper arm. His grip was like iron, a sudden, shocking violation. The pressure was immense, digging into Alex's bicep. "I told you to stop," he growled. "You don't get to decide what happens here. I do." The world seemed to slow down. The feel of Novak's fingers digging into his flesh, the sight of his patient's face, still slack-jawed, a trickle of blood from the incision running down his neck. The sound of the patient's wife letting out a strangled sob. This was it. The line had been crossed. This was no longer a disagreement over jurisdiction. This was a direct physical assault on his ability to do his job, and by extension, a direct threat to his patient's life. Alex looked from Novak's hand on his arm up to the mirrored sunglasses, which reflected a distorted fisheye image of his own face, his expression a mask of cold fury. "Take your hand off me, officer," Alex said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You are interfering with emergency medical care." "You're under arrest," Novak declared, his voice booming with a sense of finality. He seemed to relish the words, the ultimate expression of his authority. The statement was so absurd, so completely divorced from the reality of the situation, that for a moment Alex could only stare at him. Arrested? For what? For refusing to let a man suffocate to death on a pier? "Arrested for what?" Alex demanded, yanking his arm from Novak's grasp with a sharp, decisive movement. He immediately turned back to his patient, his focus snapping back to the only thing that mattered. He couldn't afford to be distracted. The man's life depended on the steady rhythm of his hand on the bag, but his mind was a maelstrom. The situation had escalated from dangerously absurd to completely surreal. "Obstruction of justice and resisting a law enforcement officer," Novak shouted, his voice ringing with a triumphant edge, as if he'd just won a great victory. The crowd gasped. The patient's wife cried out, "No! He was saving him! You can't do this!" Sarah was jogging back from the ambulance with the folded stretcher, her face a canvas of disbelief as she heard Novak's words. She froze 20 feet away, unsure of what to do. Alex was done talking. He was done negotiating with this man's fragile ego. He had a patient to transport. "Sarah, we are leaving now!" he yelled, his voice carrying across the pier. "Get the stretcher here, let's load and go!" But as Sarah started to move forward again, Novak acted. He lunged at Alex, grabbing him not by the arm this time, but by the shoulder of his uniform, and violently yanked him backward. The force was stunning. Alex, kneeling and off balance, was pulled completely away from his patient. He stumbled, catching himself on his hands to keep from falling over. The bag valve mask, ripped from his grip, clattered onto the dock, its connection to the life-saving airway dislodged. The patient was no longer receiving oxygen. A collective scream went up from the crowd. Sarah dropped the stretcher and sprinted forward. "What are you doing? He can't breathe!" Novak ignored them all. He was singularly focused on his target. He spun Alex around with surprising force, wrenching his arms behind his back with a painful torque on his shoulders. Alex, a man who kept himself in peak physical condition, was caught off guard and overpowered. The cold, unforgiving steel of handcuffs closed around his wrists. The sharp click, click, click as the ratchet tightened was the loudest sound Alex had ever heard. It was a sound of finality, a sound of utter insanity. It was the sound of a world turned upside down, where a paramedic fighting to save a life was treated like a violent felon. The bite of the metal into his skin was a sharp, grounding pain in the midst of the surreal chaos. "My patient!" Alex cried out, his professional composure finally shattering. His voice was raw with desperation as he twisted his head to look back. "Sarah, the airway! Bag him! Don't stop! You have to bag him!" Snapped out of her shock by his plea, Sarah immediately dropped to the patient's side. Her hands, though shaking with adrenaline and rage, moved with purpose. She reconnected the BVM to the tube in the man's neck and resumed squeezing the bag, her eyes darting frantically between the patient, her handcuffed partner, and the officer who had lost his mind. She was alone now. The scene erupted. The onlookers, who had been hesitant witnesses, were now an angry mob. They surged forward, shouting at Novak, their phones held high, recording every second of the outrage. "What the hell is wrong with you? He was saving his life, you idiot! We've got you on camera! The whole world is gonna see this!" Novak seemed momentarily taken aback by the crowd's reaction, but his jaw hardened. He shoved Alex forward, away from the scene of the medical emergency he had created, his hand firmly on Alex's back. "Get back, all of you! Get back now or you're all going to jail!" he roared at the workers, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and panic. As he was forced away, Alex's eyes remained locked on his patient, a man whose name he didn't even know, whose life had been in his hands just seconds before. He saw Sarah working desperately, a lone first responder in a sea of chaos. He saw the man's color already beginning to worsen, the telltale dusky blue creeping back into his skin. He knew with a sickening certainty that this delay, this insane, pointless, ego-driven delay, was costing the man precious brain cells, precious time, precious life. Every second that ticked by while he was being marched down the pier in handcuffs was a second his patient's chances of a full recovery diminished. The door of the patrol car, which Novak had left parked at the head of the pier, was opened. The heat from the black upholstery washed over him. Novak pushed him unceremoniously into the back seat. The door slammed shut with a deafening thud, sealing him in a plastic and metal cage. Through the reinforced glass and the metal grate, he watched the scene play out like a silent, horrific movie. He saw Sarah on her radio, her mouth moving frantically, likely screaming for the supervisor, for another unit, for anyone who could fix this nightmare. He saw the crowd of onlookers surrounding her, some trying to shield her from the sun, creating a protective circle around the patient. Their bodies formed a defiant barrier against the officer who had betrayed his duty to protect and serve. He was a paramedic, cuffed in the back of a police car, watching a man he had just saved begin to die again. And the person who had put him there, the person who had created this crisis, was the one who was supposed to be his partner in these life-or-death situations. Officer Kyle Novak hadn't just arrested him, he had abandoned his most fundamental duty. In that moment, sitting in the suffocating heat of the car, a cold, clear resolution formed in the pit of his stomach. This would not stand. Officer Kyle Novak had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He just didn't know it yet. He thought he had won a contest of wills, asserted his dominance. What he had actually done was ignite a fire that would consume him. The back of the patrol car was an oven. The vinyl seat stuck to Alex's uniform, and the handcuffs, cinched tight behind his back, dug into his wrists with every slight movement. The air was thick with the sterile smell of plastic and the faint, acrid scent of old vomit. Through the metal partition, he watched Officer Novak, who stood beside his driver's side door, speaking into the radio microphone clipped to his shoulder. His back was to Alex, but his posture was rigid, defensive. He was crafting his narrative, turning Alex's life-saving actions into a story of obstruction, his professional urgency into a tale of non-compliance. Alex pressed his face against the hot window, his gaze fixed on the scene he'd been torn from. He could see Sarah, her small frame looking so vulnerable as she knelt over the patient, her arm rising and falling with the steady rhythm of the BVM. A man from the crowd, the same one who had yelled at Novak, was now holding the IV bag high, his face a grim mask of determination. A woman was fanning the patient's face with a folded map. It was a testament to the human spirit, strangers working together to fight for a life. A stark contrast to the uniformed officer just yards away who had actively chosen to impede that fight. The wail of an approaching siren grew steadily louder, a welcome sound that nonetheless twisted a knot in Alex's gut. Help was coming, but it was help that should never have been needed. It was backup for a scene that one person had single-handedly thrown into chaos. 4 minutes later, an eternity in critical care, another ambulance, this one from a neighboring district, screamed to a halt behind Novak's patrol car. 2 new paramedics, a man and a woman Alex vaguely recognized, jumped out and rushed to the scene with their own equipment. Alex watched as Sarah, still bagging the patient, looked up and began a frantic, hurried exchange of information. He saw her point emphatically from the patient on the ground to Alex, locked in the back of the patrol car. The male paramedic's head whipped around, his eyes widening in confusion and shock as he saw Alex's face pressed against the glass. The look was a mirror of what Alex felt, a deep, professional offense. One of us is in handcuffs while a patient is coding. It was a violation of a sacred trust, an insult to every first responder who put on the uniform. The new crew worked with swift efficiency, taking over from Sarah. They connected their own cardiac monitor, established a second IV line, and prepared to move. They worked with a flurry of controlled, expert motion, a stark reminder of the teamwork that Novak had destroyed. Alex watched as they expertly log-rolled the patient onto a backboard and then lifted him onto their stretcher, his body limp, the small tube still protruding from his neck. Was he still alive? Had his heart given out during the delay? The not knowing was a physical torment. As they wheeled the stretcher toward their ambulance, Sarah jogged over to the patrol car. Her face was pale, streaked with sweat and fury. She couldn't open the door, but she leaned close to the window, her voice strained. "They're taking him to Bayfront," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "He lost his pulse right after Novak pulled you off him. I had to start compressions." They got him back, but Alex... He was down for almost 2 minutes without a pulse, and without good oxygenation before I could get back to him. The words hit Alex like a physical blow. He lost his pulse. He had gone into full cardiac arrest, the very thing he had been fighting to prevent. The catastrophe that Novak's intervention had directly precipitated had happened. The delay wasn't theoretical anymore. It was measured in the death of heart cells, in the starvation of a brain, in the potential destruction of a life. 2 minutes, an ocean of time for a brain deprived of oxygen. "Sarah, you need to call the supervisor now," Alex instructed, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt inside. "You need to document everything, the time Novak arrived, the time he first interfered, the time of the arrest, every single second." "Already did," Sarah said, her jaw tight. "He's on his way. The whole world is about to come down on this guy's head." The other ambulance pulled away, its lights flashing, its siren cutting a path through the marina. Alex watched it go until it was just a speck in the distance, carrying away the patient he had been forced to abandon. A profound sense of failure washed over him, even though he knew logically that the failure was not his own. Officer Novak finally finished his radio call and climbed into the driver's seat. He adjusted his rearview mirror, his eyes briefly meeting Alex's in the reflection. There was no remorse in his gaze, no uncertainty, only a cold, self-satisfied hardness. He had enforced his will, and that was all that mattered. He started the engine and pulled away from the scene without a word. The silence in the car was a suffocating blanket. The only sound was the crackle of the police radio, a stream of mundane chatter that felt like it was from another universe. "That man could have permanent brain damage," Alex said, the words breaking the silence. He needed to say it. He needed him to acknowledge the consequence of his actions. "Because of you. Because you needed to see my ID while I was performing a life-saving procedure. I hope your ego is worth a man's life." Novak's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "You should have followed a lawful order," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "This is on you. You resisted." Alex leaned his head back against the hard plastic seat and closed his eyes. It was useless. Arguing with him was like arguing with a brick wall. He was insulated by his badge, by his own certainty, by a system that had clearly taught him that his authority was absolute. He had already convicted Alex in his mind to justify his own catastrophic misjudgment. But as they drove, Alex's training kicked in. Not his paramedic training, but a different kind. Assess the situation, identify the threat, formulate a plan. The threat was no longer his patient's failing body. The threat was Officer Kyle Novak and the department that stood behind him. The situation was no longer a medical crisis, but a legal one. And his plan, which was forming with crystalline clarity, was not just to survive this, but to make sure that no other first responder ever had to choose between their patient and their freedom again. The Pinellas County Justice Center was a place Alex had only ever seen from the outside, and usually from the patient bay of his ambulance. He had dropped off intoxicated individuals, people suffering mental health crises who needed to be medically cleared before being booked. He had always been on the other side of the divide, a respected professional in a clean uniform, handing over care with a signature on a form. Now, he was the one being delivered. Officer Novak led him through the sally port in handcuffs, the heavy steel doors clanging shut behind them with a sound of echoing finality. Novak gripped his arm, steering him through the corridors as if he were a common criminal. The air inside was cold, recycled, and smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. Officers at their desks looked up as they passed, their conversations faltering. Their eyes registered his uniform first, then the handcuffs, and a wave of confusion and curiosity rippled through the room. A paramedic in cuffs was not a common sight. Novak pushed him toward the booking desk, a high counter presided over by a world-weary-looking sergeant, a man in his 50s with graying temples and a nameplate that read S.G.T. Peterson. "Got one for booking," Novak announced, his voice unnecessarily loud. "Obstruction and resisting." Sergeant Peterson looked up from his paperwork, his gaze falling on Alex, then on Novak. He raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Resisting him?" He looked back at Alex. I know you. You're Reyes from Station 7. You brought in that guy who fell off the ladder last week. What in God's name is going on, Novak? He refused to follow a lawful order at a scene, Novak said, puffing out his chest slightly. Interfered with my investigation. What investigation? Peterson pressed, his tone sharp. He wasn't buying it. He was on a medical call at the marina. I heard the chatter. A man down, anaphylaxis. What exactly did he obstruct? His allergic reaction? The sarcasm was thick, and a few officers within earshot chuckled. Novak's face flushed a deep red. He refused to provide identification and became belligerent. Sergeant, I was in the middle of performing a surgical airway on a patient who wasn't breathing, Alex interjected, his voice calm and measured. I informed the officer that I would provide my credentials as soon as the patient was stabilized for transport. His life was the priority. Peterson's eyes narrowed, looking from Alex's resolute face to Novak's defensive one. The veteran sergeant had been on the job for nearly 30 years. He could smell a bad arrest from a mile away, and this one reeked. You pulled a medic away from a man who wasn't breathing to ask for his driver's license, he asked Novak, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. Is that what you're telling me? I was securing the scene, Novak insisted, but his voice had lost some of its bluster under the veteran's icy stare. Peterson just shook his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment on his face. He turned to the booking officer. Process him and be quick about it. Get his union rep on the phone. He shot a final withering glare at Novak. My office, now! The booking process was a systematic stripping away of dignity. Alex's fingerprints were taken, the ink smearing on his skin. A mugshot was taken, the flash of the camera capturing his exhausted but defiant expression. He was instructed to remove his personal belongings. His wallet, which contained his driver's license and his paramedic certifications. His phone, his watch. Each item was placed in a clear plastic bag and catalogued with bureaucratic indifference. The irony was suffocating. The very identification Novak had deemed more important than a man's life was now being handled as evidence of his supposed crime. The young officer handling the booking, a man named Davies, seemed deeply uncomfortable with the entire situation. He handled Alex's credentials with a reverence that bordered on an apology. 15 years on the job, decorated, advanced cardiac life support, pediatric advanced life support, critical care certified, he muttered, reading from Alex's IDs as he logged them. He looked up at Alex, his eyes full of a conflict he couldn't hide. Sir, are the cuffs too tight? Did you sustain any injuries during the arrest? I'm fine, Alex replied, his voice flat. But you should ask my patient that question, the one your colleague prevented me from treating. Davies flinched and quickly looked down, focusing on his paperwork. The message had been received. Through a nearby office door, Alex could hear the muffled but heated sounds of Sergeant Peterson's voice rising and falling in a controlled fury as he dressed down Officer Novak. The words weren't clear, but the tone was. Novak wasn't being praised for his decisive action. He was being grilled. The first cracks in his wall of authority were beginning to show. After the paperwork was complete, Officer Davies led him down a short hallway to a holding cell. The heavy metal door slid open with a groan. I'm sorry, sir. It'll just be until we can get things sorted out. The door slammed shut, and the lock engaged with a deafening clang. Alex was alone. The cell was small, cold, and brutally simple, a concrete bench and a toilet. He sat down, the cold of the bench seeping through his uniform. For the first time since the call came in hours earlier, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a profound sense of violation. He had dedicated his life to helping people, to being the calm in the storm, and for doing his job, for doing what was right, he had been locked in a cage. He put his head in his hands, not in despair, but in a quiet, simmering rage. This was more than just a bad cop having a bad day. This was a systemic failure, and he was going to burn it to the ground. Time in the holding cell was a thick, syrupy thing that refused to move. Alex measured its passage by the changing shifts of light through the small, high window and the distant, muffled sounds of the station. He heard phones ringing, officers laughing, the routine hum of a world that had not stopped for his injustice. Each minute that passed felt like an accusation, a fresh layer of insult on the injury. He replayed the encounter with Novak in his mind, dissecting every word, every action. Could he have handled it differently? Should he have been more compliant, shown him the ID and hoped for the best? The answer every time was a resolute no. Compliance would have been a betrayal of his patient. It would have meant conceding that a police officer's demand for paperwork superseded a paramedic's duty to save a life. It was a principle he would not, could not, surrender. But the cost of that principle was this: a cold concrete bench and the gnawing uncertainty about the fate of the man from the marina. He'd been in the cell for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 90 minutes when he heard footsteps approaching. Not the heavy, purposeful tread of a uniformed officer, but a quicker, more energetic cadence. A man in a tailored navy suit stopped in front of his cell door. He was in his late 40s with a sharp, intelligent face, a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that seemed to assess everything in a single sweeping glance. He carried a leather briefcase that looked both expensive and well-used. "Alex Reyes?" he asked, his voice calm and confident. Alex stood up and walked to the bars. "Yes. My name is Marcus Thorne. I'm an attorney with the Paramedics Union. Your partner Sarah called your supervisor, and your supervisor called me. I came as fast as I could." He offered a small, reassuring smile. "Let's get you out of here." A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees washed over Alex. He wasn't alone anymore. The system he had dedicated his life to was now fighting for him. "Thank you for coming." "Don't thank me yet," Thorne said, already pulling a legal pad and a pen from his briefcase. "I've already spoken with Sergeant Peterson. He's displeased with his officer's conduct, to put it mildly, but the arrest report has been filed. Novak is doubling down. We need to build our case starting right now. I want you to tell me everything that happened from the moment you got the call. Don't leave out a single detail, no matter how small." Alex began his story with the precision of a trained medical professional reporting a patient's history. He recounted the entire event: the dispatch call, the patient's condition, the rapid airway closure, the decision to perform the cricothyrotomy. Then he described Officer Novak's arrival, his tone, his posture, his immediate demands. He detailed his repeated attempts to explain the medical urgency, Novak's refusal to listen, his escalation, the physical assault, and the arrest. Thorne listened intently, his pen flying across the page, his expression growing grimmer with every word. He would occasionally interrupt with a sharp, clarifying question. Did he ever state what crime he was investigating? No, just that it was a potential crime scene and he needed to secure it. Did he ask about the patient's condition? Did he show any concern for the man's well-being? None. His only concern was establishing his authority and seeing my ID. And you told him where your ID was? I told him it was in the ambulance and he could verify my credentials with my partner or dispatch, but that I would not stop active treatment of a critical patient. Thorne nodded, a grim satisfaction on his face. That's perfect. You established a clear willingness to comply once the exigent medical circumstance was resolved. His refusal to accept that is key. He looked up from his notes. Alex, what he did wasn't just a bad judgment call. It was illegal. State law is crystal clear on the issue of interfering with emergency medical personnel. The arrest was unlawful from the moment he laid hands on you. He closed his notepad. They'll release you within the hour. The charges of obstruction and resisting are baseless. They won't even make it to a prosecutor's desk. This is a classic case of what we call contempt of cop, and it's not a real crime. Novak arrested you because you challenged his authority, not because you broke the law. What about my patient? Alex asked, the question that had been tormenting him for hours. Do you know anything? Thorne's expression softened, the hard legal edge replaced by a somber humanity. Sarah gave me an update. He was transported to Bayfront General. His name is Robert Miller. He did go into full cardiac arrest at the scene, as you feared. They got a pulse back in the ambulance. He paused, letting the weight of the next words settle. But he was without a pulse for several minutes. They have him in a medically induced coma in the ICU. The doctors are worried about hypoxic brain injury. The neurologist told his wife, "The delay in definitive care is going to be a major factor in his outcome." The words were a hammer blow. Hypoxic brain injury, the most feared outcome second only to death. It meant that even if Robert Miller survived, he might not be the same person. He could have cognitive deficits, memory loss, physical disabilities. A life, a family, potentially shattered. The family knows what happened, Thorne continued, his voice low. Multiple witnesses from the marina stayed and gave statements to Sarah's supervisor. They described Novak's actions in detail. They're furious. True to Thorne's word, the cell door slid open 40 minutes later. Sergeant Peterson was standing there, his expression stern. "You're being released on your own recognizance, Reyes. The charges are being reviewed, but I don't expect them to stick." He handed Alex the plastic bag with his belongings. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice low, "I'm sorry this happened." He was out of line. Alex just nodded, taking his property. The apology was a small concession, but it was something. As he walked out of the station with Marcus Thorne at his side, blinking in the harsh afternoon sun, he felt like he was surfacing after being held underwater. He was free, but he wasn't whole. A part of him was still back on that pier, fighting for a life that had been needlessly endangered. And another part of him was now steeling itself for the bigger fight to come. This wasn't over. It had just begun. Sarah was waiting for him in the parking lot, leaning against the side of their ambulance, which she'd been allowed to retrieve. Her uniform was rumpled, and her face was etched with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She straightened up as soon as she saw him, rushing forward to pull him into a firm, sisterly hug. "Alex, my God, are you okay?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been better," he said, pulling back. "Tell me about Robert Miller. What's the latest?" Sarah's face clouded over. She took a deep breath. "It's bad. Really bad. I stayed at the hospital until they got him settled in the ICU. His wife, Karen, is there with their son. The doctor came out to talk to them. He said because of the prolonged hypoxia and the cardiac arrest, he sustained significant brain damage. They don't know how much yet. They won't know until they try to wake him up, but they're preparing the family for the worst." The words landed like stones in his stomach. Every paramedic lives with the fear of losing a patient or having a bad outcome. But this was different. This wasn't a loss to a disease or an injury they couldn't overcome. This was a loss engineered by a man's ego. Those precious minutes Novak had stolen from them while he postured and demanded and finally arrested Alex, those were the minutes Robert Miller's brain was being starved, his future draining away. The image of Novak's smug, self-satisfied face flashed in Alex's mind, and his simmering anger ignited into a white-hot flame. Marcus Thorne, who had been standing back to give them a moment, stepped forward. His expression was grim. "This confirms our path forward," he said. "The harm is no longer theoretical. We have a direct, documented, and catastrophic consequence of Officer Novak's actions. We're no longer just talking about your civil rights being violated, Alex. We're talking about a man who may be permanently disabled or die because a police officer couldn't handle being told no." They drove to Thorne's office, a sleek, modern space in downtown St. Petersburg that felt a world away from the grit of the holding cell. For the next 3 hours, Alex gave a formal, recorded statement. Thorne's team was already at work, filing motions, contacting witnesses, and drafting the initial complaint. But something else was happening, something beyond their control. One of the witnesses at the marina, a college student on vacation, had not only given a statement to the fire department supervisor, he had also sent his phone video to a local news station. By the time Alex was finishing his statement, his phone, which he'd gotten back with his other belongings, began to vibrate. Then it vibrated again, and again, It lit up with a furious cascade of texts and missed calls from friends, family, and colleagues from across the state. "Turn on the news," Sarah said, holding up her own phone, her eyes wide. Thorne switched on the large television in his office, and there it was. The shaky cell phone footage was leading the 5 o'clock news. The video was damning. It clearly showed Alex on his knees, working on his patient. It captured Novak's aggressive posture and his sharp, demanding voice. And then it showed the critical moment. Novak yanking Alex backward, away from the patient, and wrenching his arms behind his back. The clicks of the handcuffs were audible. The panicked shouts of the crowd and Sarah's desperate cries were the soundtrack. The image of a paramedic in uniform being forced into the back of a patrol car while his patient lay on the dock was broadcast across the Tampa Bay area. The story was perfect for the 24-hour news cycle. A hero paramedic arrested by an overzealous cop while saving a man's life. Before the local news broadcast was even over, the clip had been picked up by national news outlets. It went viral. The fire department issued a statement standing firmly behind Alex, calling his actions heroic and in accordance with the highest standards of patient care. The police department, in contrast, issued a terse defensive statement saying the incident was under internal investigation and that Officer Novak had been placed on administrative desk duty. The battle lines had been drawn. Alex, with the backing of his union and Marcus Thorne, stood on one side. On the other stood Officer Novak, and a city bureaucracy that would now go to extraordinary lengths to protect itself and its employee from the consequences of his actions. The lawsuit was filed electronically at 9 a.m. the next morning. It was an explosive document, detailing in cold, legal language the horrifying events of the previous day. It named Officer Kyle Novak and the city of Clearwater as defendants and sought unspecified damages for the violation of Alex's civil rights, emotional distress, and damage to his professional reputation. The viral video had turned a local incident into a national referendum on policing. The story was no longer just about Alex Reyes. He had become an unwilling symbol for every first responder who had ever been bullied, questioned, or impeded by a law enforcement officer on a power trip. The pressure on the city was immense and growing by the hour. The lawsuit wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a declaration of war, a war Alex had never asked for, but one he was now fully committed to winning. In the world of high-stakes litigation, the discovery process is a slow, methodical grinding of legal gears. It is a battle fought not in a courtroom, but through a relentless exchange of documents and data designed to unearth the truth, one page at a time. For months, Marcus Thorne's office was inundated with thousands of pages from the city. Training manuals, internal affairs reports, policy guidelines, and Officer Novak's complete, unredacted personnel file. Thorne and his team combed through every document, building a portrait of the man who had arrested Alex. A pattern emerged. In his short 4-year career, Officer Kyle Novak had accumulated nearly a dozen citizen complaints for excessive force and abuse of authority. There were reports of him pulling a gun on a teenager for skateboarding in a prohibited area, of illegally searching a vehicle during a routine traffic stop, of using derogatory language toward civilians. In every case, he was exonerated by an internal affairs system that seemed designed to protect its own. He was a lawsuit waiting to happen, a problem the department had ignored until it blew up in their faces on a national stage. But all of it, the personnel file, the training manuals, the past complaints, was secondary to the single digital file they had been waiting for. It arrived on a password-protected hard drive delivered by a court courier. The complete, unedited footage from Officer Kyle Novak's body camera. Thorne had it set up in a conference room on a large monitor. Alex sat beside him, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Sarah was there too, for support and to corroborate the sequence of events. "Are you ready for this?" Thorne asked him gently. Alex took a deep breath and nodded. "Play it." The video began with a jarring, unsteady view of the ground as Officer Novak got out of his patrol car. The audio was crystal clear. The roar of the marina, the crackle of his radio. Then he began walking toward the scene, his pace a brisk, authoritative stride. The camera's perspective was his own, an unnerving first-person view of the confrontation to come. He approached the circle of onlookers, his voice already sharp. "What the hell is going on here? Everybody back up, give him some space." Then the camera centered on him. A version of Alex kneeling on the ground, his back to the camera, completely engrossed in his patient. The footage was visceral, immediate. It captured the blotchy red skin of Robert Miller, the terrifying swelling of his neck and face. It was obvious to anyone, medically trained or not, that he was in extreme distress. The audio was even more damning than Alex remembered. "Drop what you're doing, right now! This is a crime scene," Novak's voice commanded, cold and devoid of any empathy. "I'm a paramedic," his own voice replied, calm and focused. "This man had a complete airway obstruction. I've just established a surgical airway." The camera showed Alex not even looking up, his hands moving with purpose, squeezing the BVM connected to the tube in his patient's neck. The footage perfectly corroborated his story. His attention was, and remained, on saving a life. "I said for the last time, back away from him," Novak's voice repeated louder this time. The camera tilted up as Novak stepped closer, looming over the scene. It captured Alex's quick glance up, the firmness in his voice as he explained the situation, even quoting the state statute that protected him. It recorded his offer to have his credentials verified by other means, his request for a supervisor. Every word Alex had recounted in his statement was there, captured with perfect clarity. Then came the escalation. The camera lurched as Novak stepped forward to kick the medical supplies. The sound of plastic and glass scattering on the wooden dock was sharp and violent. Novak's voice, captured by the microphone inches from his mouth, was a low growl. "You seem to think you're in charge here. Let me be very clear. You are not." The most crucial moment was the arrest itself. The video showed Novak grabbing Alex's arm. It showed him yanking Alex away from the patient. The camera swung wildly, capturing the BVM clattering to the ground. Then the view became a chaotic jumble of Alex's back and the sky as Novak spun him around and forced his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic clicks of the handcuffs were picked up with perfect clarity by the microphone. The video continued for another 20 minutes. It showed the angry shouts of the crowd. It showed Sarah, her face a mask of desperation, scrambling back to the patient to resume breathing for him and begin chest compressions after his heart stopped. It showed the arrival of the second ambulance, and it showed the long, silent walk back to the patrol car where Alex was placed in the back like a piece of cargo. When the video ended, the conference room was silent. Sarah was shaking her head, her face pale. Alex felt strangely numb, vindicated, but also sickened. It was all there. Every lie in Novak's report, every self-serving statement the city had made was obliterated by this single, unblinking recording of the truth. Marcus Thorne sat back in his chair, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. He looked at Alex. "In 25 years of practicing law," he said, his voice quiet with awe, "I have never seen a more powerful piece of evidence. That camera didn't just record an unlawful arrest. It recorded a man's soul. It recorded his arrogance, his insecurity, and his utter disregard for human life." He stood up and began to pace the room, energized. "This changes everything. Their strategy was to paint you as the aggressor, as uncooperative. This video proves you were the only person in that interaction who remained calm, professional, and focused on the job at hand. Novak wasn't a cop maintaining order. He was a bully who couldn't handle a man telling him he had more important things to do than stroke his ego." Thorne stopped pacing and looked at the blank screen. "The city's lawyers will see this footage, and they will know their case is unwinnable. They'll come back to the table with a real settlement offer, but that's not what we're going to do." He turned to Alex, his eyes glinting. "We're going to show this video to a jury. We're going to let 12 ordinary citizens see what Officer Kyle Novak did on that dock. We're going to depose him, make him watch it, and make him explain every single second of it under oath." This case is no longer about getting you a settlement. It's about getting you justice, the kind of justice that changes laws. A deposition is not a trial. There is no judge, no jury. It takes place in the sterile, soundproofed confines of a law firm's conference room. But in many ways, it is more grueling. It is a slow, methodical dissection of a witness's story, designed to lock them into a version of events they cannot later change, and to expose every weakness, every contradiction, every lie. Officer Kyle Novak walked into the deposition room flanked by 2 attorneys from the city. His uniform was crisp, his posture ramrod straight. He carried himself with the same air of unshakable confidence he'd had on the marina dock. He was there to defend his actions, to project the image of a decisive officer who had been forced to take control of a chaotic scene from an uncooperative paramedic. He believed his badge and his version of the story would protect him. He was wrong. For the first hour, the city's attorney led Novak through his own testimony, allowing him to construct his narrative. He described arriving at a disorderly scene, his attempts to secure the area for the safety of all personnel, and paramedic Reyes's immediate and hostile refusal to comply with lawful orders. He painted a picture of himself as the calm center of a storm, a professional doing his job. Then it was Marcus Thorne's turn. Thorne began calmly, his questions simple and direct. "Officer Novak, you've been with the Clearwater Police Department for 4 years, is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "And in that time, have you received training on interacting with other first responders at emergency scenes?" "Yes, sir. We receive extensive training." "And does that training instruct you that the immediate life-saving care of a patient is the top priority at a medical emergency?" Novak shifted in his seat. "My priority is to secure the scene for the safety of all personnel." "That wasn't my question, officer," Thorne said, his voice still mild. "Does your training instruct you that a paramedic's active treatment of a critical patient takes precedence over administrative requests, like asking for identification?" The city's attorney objected, but Thorne just smiled. "Let me rephrase. At any point did you believe the patient, Mr. Miller, was not in serious medical distress?" "I am not a medical professional," Novak said stiffly. "I could not make that assessment." "Exactly," Thorne pounced. "You are not a medical professional, yet you felt qualified to order the actual medical professional on scene to stop providing life-saving care. Is that correct?" "I ordered him to step back so I could secure the scene." Thorne nodded slowly, then turned to his paralegal. "Please play the first video exhibit. Body camera footage of Officer Novak. Timestamp 14:06:18. The large monitor at the end of the conference table flickered to life. The deposition room was filled with the sounds of the marina, and the video began. Thorne had Novak watch the first 2 minutes, showing his arrival and his initial aggressive demands. "Officer," Thorne said, pausing the video just after Novak had yelled, "I said back away from him." At this point, you had been on scene for less than 45 seconds. You had not spoken to any witnesses. You had not assessed any potential threats. Yet you decided the most important action was to stop the paramedic from treating his patient. Why? "I was establishing control of the scene," Novak repeated, his jaw tight. "Control over what exactly? A man on his knees trying to save another man's life?" Thorne let the question hang in the air before playing the next segment, the one where Alex calmly explained the procedure and the patient's condition. He paused it again. "Officer, on this video, we can hear paramedic Reyes, a highly decorated and experienced professional, telling you he has performed a surgical airway on a patient who was not breathing. Did you understand the gravity of that statement?" Novak hesitated. "I understood it was a medical situation." "And yet, your response was not to ask how you could help. It was not to clear the area for the stretcher. It was to demand his identification. Is that right?" "It is standard procedure to identify all parties on a scene." "Is it standard procedure to arrest a paramedic for prioritizing his dying patient over your request for his driver's license?" Thorne's voice was rising now, losing its gentle tone and taking on a hard prosecutorial edge. For the next 4 hours, Thorne dismantled Novak's story piece by piece, using the officer's own camera footage as the wrecking ball. He forced Novak to watch himself kick the medical kit. "Please describe for the record what is happening in this video, officer." Novak stared at the screen, his face pale. "I moved some of his equipment with my foot." "You kicked a sterile medical kit, scattering its contents, while a paramedic was trying to save a life," Thorne corrected him. "Why did you do that?" "I was clearing a path." "A path to where, officer? The only thing you did after kicking his equipment was step closer to him and threaten him." Thorne made him watch the moment he yanked Alex away from the patient. "Can you explain the tactical necessity of physically removing the one person who was keeping Mr. Miller alive?" By the end of the deposition, Kyle Novak was a changed man. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a sullen, defensive silence. His carefully constructed narrative of a hero cop had been exposed as a self-serving fantasy. The transcript would show him to be evasive, argumentative, and ultimately unable to provide a single credible justification for his actions. He had walked into the room a confident officer of the law. He walked out a man who knew his career was over. The city's attorneys knew it too. Their faces were grim. They had built their entire defense around the testimony of their officer, and Thorne had just reduced that testimony to rubble. The unblinking eye of the camera, combined with Thorne's relentless questioning, had left them with nothing. Their star witness had just become their biggest liability. The day after the deposition, Marcus Thorne's phone rang. It was the lead counsel for the city of Clearwater. The tone was no longer dismissive or condescending. It was the sound of defeat. "They want to settle," Marcus Thorne told Alex later that day in his office. The call had been exactly what he expected. The deposition was a complete disaster for them. They know what that body camera footage will do to a jury. They're no longer talking about nuisance value. "What are they offering?" Alex asked, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. For months, his life had been a surreal limbo. He was on paid leave, a paramedic who couldn't respond to calls. His days were filled with meetings and legal preparations, not sirens and medical crises. He wanted it to be over. Thorne let out a short, humorless laugh. "You should sit down for this. They're offering to pay your legal fees and give you $50,000 for your trouble." Alex was silent for a moment, processing the sheer audacity of the offer. $50,000. It wasn't a settlement, it was an insult. It was the monetary equivalent of a pat on the head, a pittance meant to make the problem go away before it got too expensive or embarrassing. It was an offer made by people who saw this not as a gross violation of rights and a near-fatal dereliction of duty, but as a public relations inconvenience to be managed. It was an offer that completely ignored the central victim of the entire ordeal. "What about Robert Miller?" Alex asked, his voice laced with ice. Thorne's expression darkened. "That's the other part of this. They are in separate negotiations with Miller's family. He survived, but just barely." Robert Miller had spent 8 days in a medically induced coma. When they finally woke him up, the full extent of the damage was devastatingly clear. The prolonged lack of oxygen had caused a severe hypoxic brain injury. He could speak, but his words were slurred and slow. His right side was partially paralyzed, and his short-term memory was virtually gone. He would never work as a charter boat captain again. He would require round-the-clock care for the rest of his life. He was a 54-year-old man trapped inside a broken body, his life and his family's life permanently and catastrophically altered because of a 7-minute delay on a sunny pier. "They're trying to buy our silence so they can lowball his family," Alex said, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "If we settle quietly, their case gets weaker." "Exactly," Thorne confirmed. "This offer comes with a strict, ironclad non-disclosure agreement. They want to bury this. They want to ensure that body camera footage is never shown in a public court, that Novak's deposition transcript is never released. They want to pay you to pretend this never happened." That was the deal breaker. They wanted to buy his story, to bury the truth he had fought so hard to bring to light. "Tell them no," Alex said, the two words firm and clear. The doubt and exhaustion he had felt moments before vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. "Tell them I'll see them in court." A slow smile spread across Marcus Thorne's face. It was the answer he had been hoping for. "I already told them their offer was offensive, and that our next conversation would be during jury selection. This was their gambit. They were hoping you were just looking for a quick payday, that the pressure would make you fold. They misjudged you." They had. The city's lawyers and risk managers had made a critical error. They had mistaken Alex's quiet professionalism for weakness. They didn't understand that his fight was no longer just about his own vindication. It had become about Robert Miller. Every victory for Alex would be a victory for Robert. The city's refusal to take his lawsuit seriously had the opposite effect they intended. Instead of silencing him, it galvanized him. And when news of the insulting hush money offer leaked to the press, a strategic leak from Thorne's office, the story exploded with renewed fury. Editorials were written condemning the city's callousness. National news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a textbook example of police overreach and municipal arrogance. A GoFundMe page started by Alex's fire station to help the Miller family with their staggering medical bills was flooded with donations from strangers across the country. Paramedics from as far away as California and New York sent messages of solidarity. His stand was a declaration. He was turning down a settlement for a principle. He was choosing the uncertainty and agony of a public trial over the comfort of a private payout. It was a choice that would require immense courage. But for Alex, it was the only choice he could live with. He had fought for his patient on the side of the dock, and now he would fight for him, and for every paramedic who might face the same choice in a court of law. The city thought they could buy his silence. They were about to learn that his integrity was not for sale. With settlement talks officially dead, the machinery of the federal court system ground toward a trial date. The weeks leading up to it were a blur of intense preparation for Alex. Marcus Thorne and his team put him through mock cross-examinations, peppering him with the most aggressive, accusatory questions the city's lawyers could possibly devise. They wanted to prepare him for the stress of the witness stand, to ensure that his composure, which had been so powerful on the body cam footage, would hold under the pressure of a courtroom. The trial was not just a legal proceeding, it was a form of theater, and the first act was jury selection, or voir dire. This was where the tone of the entire trial would be set. It was a painstaking process of questioning a pool of ordinary citizens to uncover biases, both conscious and unconscious, that could influence their judgment. Alex sat at the plaintiff's table beside Marcus Thorne, watching as dozens of potential jurors were brought into the stately, wood-paneled courtroom. They were a cross-section of the community: teachers, retirees, mechanics, small business owners. 12 of them would be chosen to decide his fate. The city's legal team, led by a sharp, immaculately dressed man named David Chen, was looking for a specific type of juror. They wanted people who were instinctively pro-law enforcement, people who believed that questioning a police officer was inherently wrong. They asked questions like, "Do you believe it is a citizen's duty to comply with any order given by a police officer without question?" And, "Do you have any family members who have had a negative experience with law enforcement?" Marcus Thorne's approach was the opposite. He was searching for empathy. He was looking for people who could understand the concept of conflicting duties, people who trusted medical professionals, and people who were skeptical of unchecked authority. His questions were more nuanced. Imagine a situation where a firefighter tells you to evacuate a building because it's on fire, but a police officer tells you to stay put for an investigation. In that moment of conflict, whose expertise would you be more inclined to trust regarding the immediate threat to your life? One potential juror, a retired Air Force pilot, answered without hesitation. "You trust the expert in the relevant field. The firefighter knows fire. The cop knows the law. You don't ask a lawyer to put out a fire." Thorne made a small, satisfied checkmark on his notepad. Another potential juror, a young software engineer, was questioned by the city's attorney. "Do you believe police officers have a difficult and dangerous job?" "Of course," the young man answered. "And do you believe they sometimes have to make split-second decisions to maintain control?" "Yes, but I also believe they have a responsibility not to create a crisis where one doesn't exist." Chen thanked him and moved on, but Thorne's eyes lingered on the man. He had found someone who could see the gray areas. The process took 2 full days. It was a fascinating high-stakes exercise in human psychology. Alex watched as potential jurors were dismissed for a variety of reasons. One man whose brother was a police officer was struck by Thorne. A woman who expressed deep distrust for all forms of government authority was struck by the city. Slowly, methodically, the pool was whittled down. By the end of the second day, they had their jury, 12 citizens and 2 alternates. It was a diverse group. The retired pilot had made it. So had the young software engineer. There was a registered nurse, a high school history teacher, a stay-at-home father, a plumber, and several others. Thorne was pleased. It was not a jury that was inherently anti-police, but it was a jury of thoughtful, independent thinkers. They were people who respected authority, but were not blinded by it. They were people who would be able to watch that body camera footage and see not an officer and a civilian, but 2 public servants with competing duties, and judge which duty was more important. As they left the courthouse that evening, the reality of the situation finally hit Alex with its full weight. The next morning, the trial would begin. His life, his reputation, and a cause that had become bigger than himself would be placed in the hands of those 12 strangers. "How are you feeling?" Thorne asked, sensing his anxiety. "Like I'm about to run the most important call of my life," Alex admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Thorne stopped and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've been preparing for this your whole life, Alex. Not in law books, but in the back of an ambulance, in every crisis you've ever managed. All you have to do tomorrow is the same thing you did on that dock. Stay calm, be professional, and tell the truth. The truth is all we need." His words were a comfort, but as Alex drove home, he knew that the truth was a fragile thing. In a courtroom, it could be twisted, obscured, and attacked. His principled stand had led him to this moment. Now all he could do was trust that the truth, and the 12 people chosen to hear it, would be enough. The trial began not with Alex, but with Karen Miller. Marcus Thorne knew that before the jury could understand the crime against Alex, they had to understand the stakes. They had to see the human cost of Officer Novak's actions. Karen, a woman in her early 50s with tired, grief-stricken eyes, walked slowly to the witness stand. Her every movement seemed weighted down by a sorrow that was too heavy to bear. Getting her to the courtroom had been an immense challenge. Her life was now a constant cycle of hospital visits and caregiver duties for the man who was, and was not, her husband. But she had insisted. She needed to do this for Alex. Thorne approached the witness stand, his demeanor gentle and respectful. "Mrs. Miller, could you please tell the jury a little about your husband, Robert, before the incident?" Karen took a sip of water, her hand shaking. He was full of life," she said, her voice soft but clear. "He was a charter boat captain. He loved the ocean more than anything. He was strong. He could fix anything. He was the one everyone turned to. He was my rock." She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring. "The man I bring home from the rehab center now, he's not the man I married. He's a stranger." The courtroom was silent, captivated by her simple, powerful testimony. "Can you describe for the jury what you witnessed on the marina dock that day?" Thorne asked. "I remember the wasp," she said, her eyes distant. "And then he couldn't breathe. It happened so fast, and then Alex and Sarah arrived. They were so calm. Alex was working on him, and I felt this wave of hope. He was going to be okay. And then that police officer showed up." Her voice hardened. The sorrow was replaced by a steely anger. "He started yelling. He wouldn't listen. Alex kept telling him, 'He can't breathe, we have to go.' But the officer just kept getting angrier. I saw him I saw him pull Alex off of my husband. I saw him put handcuffs on the one person who was saving Rob's life. I screamed at him to stop. Everyone did. But he didn't care. He was like a bulldog. He had his teeth in, and he wasn't letting go. Her eyes filled with tears. She looked directly at the jury. My husband's heart stopped. While that officer was putting handcuffs on the paramedic, my husband's heart stopped beating. The city's attorney, David Chen, rose for cross-examination, his approach cautious. He knew he had to tread lightly. Attacking a sympathetic victim was a risky strategy. Mrs. Miller, you have a separate lawsuit filed against the city of Clearwater, don't you? Chen asked. Yes, we do. And that lawsuit seeks millions of dollars in damages, correct? It seeks to cover my husband's medical bills, which are already over $1 million, and to provide for the 24-hour care he will need for the rest of his life, now that I've had to quit my job to take care of him, Karen said, her voice gaining a spark of its former strength. So you have a significant financial interest in the outcome of this trial, don't you? If the jury finds in favor of Mr. Reyes, it would certainly help your case, wouldn't it? Karen leaned forward, her gaze fixed on him. Mr. Chen, if I won the lottery tomorrow, it wouldn't give my husband his memory back. It wouldn't let him walk without a brace. It wouldn't let him take his own boat out on the water ever again. She then turned her head and looked at the jury, her voice breaking. But I can tell you what might have. A few more minutes. That's what the doctors told us. A few more minutes. If the paramedic who was trying to save my husband's life had been allowed to do his job, if he had gotten him to the hospital just a few minutes sooner, he might have walked out of there. He might still be my husband. She took a shuddering breath. So you can ask me about my lawsuit, but what this is really about is time. The time that your police officer stole from my husband, from me, from our family. Chen had no more questions. He had tried to paint her as a biased witness motivated by greed, and instead she had turned it around, delivering the most powerful indictment of his client's actions he could have imagined. She had given the jury a clock. She had shown them that the conflict on that dock wasn't about abstract legal principles. It was about minutes and seconds that separated a full life from a broken one. The rest of the day was filled with testimony from other witnesses. Sarah took the stand, her voice shaking with anger as she recounted how she had to watch her partner and friend be arrested while their patient went into cardiac arrest. One of the tourists testified, his cell phone video authenticated and prepared as evidence. The ER doctor who treated Robert took the stand, explaining in precise clinical detail how the delay in transport and the interruption of care had directly contributed to the severity of the hypoxic brain injury. With each witness, Thorne was building a wall of evidence around Officer Novak, brick by brick. He was showing the jury the full context of the situation, the ripple effect of one man's bad decision. By the time court adjourned for the day, the atmosphere in the room had shifted palpably. The jurors were no longer just passive observers. They were invested. They had heard from the survivor's wife, from the partner, from the witnesses, from the doctor. They had heard the story from every angle except two, Alex's and Officer Novak's. The stage was set for the main event. The next day, the jury would finally see the video. The energy in the courtroom was electric on the fourth day of the trial. This was the day the jury would see what happened for themselves. Marcus Thorne began the morning by calling his final witness, Alex Reyes. Alex walked to the stand with a quiet confidence. He looked professional and composed in a simple dark suit. For an hour, Thorne led him through his story, his training, and the events on the marina dock. His testimony was clear, concise, and devoid of melodrama. He spoke not as a victim, but as a professional, explaining a catastrophic failure in interagency cooperation. He described the medical situation in detail, explaining to the jury what anaphylaxis does to the human body and why every second was critical. Then Thorne walked to the large screen set up in front of the jury box. Your Honor, the plaintiff would now like to play the body camera footage of Officer Kyle Novak. The lights in the courtroom were dimmed slightly. The room was silent as the video began to play. For the next 10 minutes, the jury was transported to the side of that dock. They saw the scene not from a distance, but through the eyes of the man who caused the crisis. They saw Alex's focused professionalism. They saw Robert Miller's swollen, dying face. They heard Novak's aggressive demands and Alex's calm, firm refusals. They heard him literally pleading for his patient's life. And then they saw it. They saw Novak, from his own point of view, lunge forward and grab Alex. They saw him yank Alex away from his patient. They saw him spin Alex around and force his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic clicks of the handcuffs echoed through the silent courtroom. Several jurors flinched. One woman put her hand over her mouth in shock. They weren't just hearing about the arrest anymore, they were witnessing an assault. When the video ended and the lights came up, the impact was visceral. The footage had transformed the case. It was no longer a matter of he said, she said. It was a matter of objective, undeniable reality. The city's attorney, David Chen, knew he was in deep trouble. His cross-examination of Alex was tentative. He tried to portray Alex as insubordinate, but the video had already refuted that. Mr. Reyes, you'd agree that when a police officer gives you an order, you should follow it. I agree that I should follow a lawful order, Alex corrected him gently. An order that forces me to abandon a dying patient in violation of my medical oath and state law is not a lawful order. Chen had no effective rebuttal. Alex's testimony, backed by the video, was a fortress. After Alex stepped down, the defense had no choice but to call their only witness, Officer Kyle Novak. He walked to the stand, his face a grim mask. He knew what was coming. Chen led him through his testimony, but it was a hollow exercise. Everyone in the room had already seen the truth. His claims of a chaotic scene and a belligerent paramedic sounded absurd after watching the video. Then it was Thorne's turn for cross-examination. He approached the witness stand, not with anger, but with a quiet, surgical precision. Officer Novak, he began, we've all seen the footage from your body camera. We saw you arrest a paramedic while he was actively treating a man whose airway was closed. I have only one question for you. Watching that video today, is there anything you would have done differently? It was a lifeline, a chance for Novak to show some remorse, some humanity. He could have said, in hindsight, I should have waited. He could have said, I misjudged the situation. He could have said anything to show the jury he understood the gravity of his mistake. But he didn't. His pride, the same pride that had caused this disaster, would not let him. No, Novak said, his voice defiant. I stand by my actions. I was following my training to secure the scene. Thorne let the answer hang in the air, a stunning admission of unrepentant arrogance. He walked back to the plaintiff's table. No further questions, Your Honor. It was a mic drop moment. In that single defiant answer, Kyle Novak had sealed his own fate and the fate of the city he worked for. He had looked the jury in the eye and told them that given the chance, he would do it all again. The closing arguments were a study in contrasts. Chen did his best with a losing hand, pleading with the jury not to judge an officer with the benefit of hindsight. Then Marcus Thorne rose. He stood directly in front of the jury box. This case is about a choice, he began, his voice a quiet, righteous anger. Officer Kyle Novak looked at a life hanging in the balance and decided that seeing a paramedic's driver's license was more important. Alex Reyes also had a choice. He chose his oath. He chose his patient. He chose to be a paramedic. He paused, letting his final words sink in. Your verdict today will do more than decide this case. It will send a message about what we value. Do we value blind obedience over professional duty? Do we value a badge over a human life? Send a message that the answer is no. The jury filed out of the room. The wait was excruciating. 2 hours later, they returned. The foreman, the retired Air Force pilot, handed a slip of paper to the clerk. In the matter of Reyes versus Novak and the city of Clearwater, the clerk began, her voice echoing in the silent room. On the claim of unlawful seizure in violation of the Fourth Amendment, we, the jury, find for the plaintiff, Alex Reyes. A gasp went through the courtroom. On the claim of false arrest, we find for the plaintiff, Alex Reyes. Alex squeezed his eyes shut as tears began to stream down his face. Marcus Thorne put a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We will now read the damages," the clerk continued. "For compensatory damages, including emotional distress and reputational harm, we award the plaintiff $1.8 million. The number was staggering, but she wasn't finished. "And for punitive damages to be levied against Officer Kyle Novak and the city of Clearwater for its willful and reckless disregard for the plaintiff's constitutional rights, we award the plaintiff $16 million. The courtroom erupted in stunned murmurs. $17.8 million. It was a thunderous verdict, a number so large it was clearly meant not just to compensate, but to punish. The jury hadn't just sided with Alex. They had adopted his outrage. They had sent the message Thorne had asked for, a message so loud and clear it would be heard in every police precinct and city hall in America. Alex sobbed, not for the money, but for the overwhelming sense of vindication. The jury had seen him, they had heard him, and they had believed him. Justice had been done. The verdict was more than a legal victory, it was an earthquake. The $17.8 million judgment sent shockwaves through the city of Clearwater and beyond. It was a headline-grabbing figure that forced an immediate and painful reckoning within the city's leadership and police department. The message from the jury was unequivocal. The old way of doing business, of protecting bad cops and ignoring systemic problems, was no longer acceptable and would come at a devastating financial cost. The first domino to fall was Officer Kyle Novak. Less than a week after the verdict, following a rushed internal affairs investigation that suddenly found the courage to state the obvious, he was fired from the Clearwater Police Department. His career in law enforcement was over, his name forever linked to one of the largest civil rights verdicts in the state's history. But the changes didn't stop there. Facing immense public pressure and the looming, even larger lawsuit from Robert Miller's family, which they quickly settled out of court for an undisclosed but reportedly massive sum, the city council approved a sweeping overhaul of police training and policy. They brought in outside consultants to rewrite the department's protocols for interacting with other first responders. The new policy, which became known informally as the Reyes Mandate, was explicit. At a medical emergency scene, the senior paramedic, or EMT, was in command of patient care, and any interference by law enforcement outside of a direct threat to life was grounds for immediate disciplinary action. The story of Alex's ordeal and the staggering verdict became a case study in police academies and paramedic training programs nationwide. The body camera footage, once a piece of evidence, was now a powerful educational tool. It was used to teach new recruits on both sides of the divide about the critical importance of communication, respect, and a clear understanding of roles at an emergency scene. It showed in stark, undeniable detail how arrogance and a rigid adherence to authority could escalate a situation with tragic consequences. For Alex, the aftermath was a whirlwind. He was hailed as a hero, a champion for first responders. He was invited to speak at national EMS conferences and was instrumental in lobbying the Florida state legislature. A year after his trial, the governor signed the First Responder Protection Act into law, a bill that codified many of the principles his case had brought to light, creating specific legal protections for medical personnel against obstruction or interference while performing their duties. Alex stood beside the governor at the signing ceremony, a reluctant but powerful symbol of change. He eventually returned to work at Station 7. The money from the settlement afforded him financial freedom, but he couldn't imagine doing anything else. The ambulance, the adrenaline, the profound privilege of being the person someone called on the worst day of their life. It was a part of who he was. Things were different, though. When he arrived at scenes, police officers treated him and his colleagues with a new level of respect, almost a reverence. They kept their distance. They offered help. They deferred to his medical judgment. His battle had created a safer environment for all of his colleagues. He had fought the war so they could do their jobs in peace. In the quiet moments after a storm, reflection offers a clarity that the chaos itself can never provide. Looking back, it becomes possible to see the intricate web of choices and circumstances that led to that sun-drenched confrontation on the dock. What drove Officer Kyle Novak? It wasn't simple malice. It was something more insidious, a deep-seated insecurity masked by a rigid, aggressive interpretation of authority. Perhaps he came from a background where strength was equated with control, and any challenge, especially from another professional in a position of expertise, was perceived not as a difference of opinion, but as a direct threat to his identity. He had been trained to see the world as a series of threats to be neutralized, and in his mind, Alex's refusal to comply made him just another threat. His badge was not a tool for service, it was armor for his fragile ego. If Novak had been able to pause, to listen, to see the dying man on the ground as a person instead of a prop in his own power play, the entire tragedy could have been averted. If his training had emphasized de-escalation and interagency respect as much as it emphasized officer safety and control, he might have become Alex's greatest ally on that dock instead of his worst obstacle.
And what of Alex?
If he had been less confident, less forged by the pressures of his past, would he have backed down? If he hadn't possessed that core of steel, perhaps he would have made the easy choice to show his ID, gambling with a stranger's life to avoid a confrontation. The victory was born not just from the injustice of the moment, but from a lifetime of preparation that had unknowingly armed him for that specific fight. His refusal was not an act of spontaneous defiance, but the logical conclusion of a career spent prioritizing life above all else. This story is a testament to the fact that one person's unwavering commitment to their duty can expose and correct a systemic flaw, creating a legacy of safety and respect for thousands who follow. It reminds us that true courage isn't about being confrontational. It's about holding fast to one's principles when it is most difficult, when the personal cost is highest. It's about understanding that sometimes the most powerful action is a firm, quiet, and unshakable no. What do you think is the most important lesson from Alex's story? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone had to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and please support our channel so we can continue to bring you these important stories.